This is Haley Solomon with the North Carolina Housing Coalition. Thank you for joining us this morning for our housing call. And without further ado, I will turn it over to our Director of Housing Policy, Stephanie Watkins-Cruz.
Good morning, everyone. I hope you all are having a great week so far. I'm going to go ahead and kick it off with the top things this week. Top of mind for us, of course, is tomorrow is Housing Day. So we are really looking forward to seeing those of you that have registered for NC Housing Day 2026 tomorrow. So we also will see a lot of you today at the training and reception. So we're really looking forward to that. Also, on today's call, we get to interview a wonderful person, Hudson Vaughn. So we'll talk a bit about property tax relief, kind of a continuation in the series of conversations we've been having over the last few weeks, looking at property tax relief versus the proposed tax levy limit. And then last but not least, there's a federal advocacy opportunity that has a deadline of this Friday, May 1st. So since we're going to have an interview today, I will just highlight a few quick things. Again, tomorrow is NC Housing Day 2026, and we are just really excited about all the support and excitement around it. We have over 177 people from across the state that will be coming to Raleigh to talk to legislators about how housing is essential infrastructure, and voters are concerned about the rising cost of housing, and the North Carolina General Assembly has a critical role to play in funding housing solutions. So we'll be asking for the North Carolina Housing Trust Fund to be expanded. We'll be asking for the funding for the Workforce Housing Loan Program to be restored, for the creation of an affordable housing infrastructure revolving loan fund, and improving property tax relief programs through common sense reforms that improve existing property tax relief programs that can actually bring targeted relief to North Carolinians that are the most cost burdened with high tax bills. And that is a perfect segue into our interview. I'd love to welcome Hudson Vaughn. He's the director of the Community Justice Collaborative here at the North Carolina Housing Coalition. Hudson joined the coalition in January of 2024 to develop the Community Justice Collaborative. He comes to the coalition with 15 plus years of community organizing, community development, and nonprofit leadership experience. Many of you already know him. He co-founded and served for a dozen years as a director of the Marion Cheek Jackson Center, an oral history and community development center in historically Black neighborhoods of Chapel Hill and Carborough. And for the last several years, Hudson has served as a consultant for housing justice and community engagement efforts across North Carolina, with a particular interest in mobilizing tools and strategies to prevent displacement in historically Black neighborhoods and support community self-determination and racial equity. Hudson has a bachelor's from UNC Chapel Hill and a master's in divinity from Duke Divinity School. I had to read through all of that because I love bragging on Hudson. Thank you, Hudson, for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
No problem. So we focused on the last few calls this month on the affordable housing property tax loophole proposal, the proposal to kind of close that loophole. We also had a call with Mark Shelburne who talked about the impact of property taxes on LIHTC, on low-income housing tax projects. And so what we wanted to talk about today is really looking at another recommendation from the House Select Committee on Property Tax Reduction and Reform, the property tax levy limit, and also wanted to talk about what real relief would look like. So could you give us an overview of the proposal that's being considered, and why do you think it's being proposed?
Yeah, sure. And you'll have to hang with me a little bit. So a levy limit restricts the overall amount of increased property tax revenue that counties and municipalities can collect from year to year. The House Select Committee on Property Tax Reform recommended putting a constitutional amendment on November's ballot that would require the state to pass legislation limiting property tax levy increases by counties and cities. Now, that's quite a mouthful, but basically it doesn't provide any specifics as to what a levy limit would be or what the processes of determining one would be, simply that the state would be required to put in place a levy limit. Because it doesn't provide specifics, it makes it harder to understand and assess. But let me give a quick example. Some other states with levy limits restrict local governments to a 2.5% increase from the previous year's property tax revenue plus any new growth. So for simplicity's sake, if a county had $100 million in property tax revenue last year and had a levy limit of 2.5% increase, that county would be restricted to $102.5 million in property tax revenue plus any new growth in this year's budget. But again, the current proposal doesn't have any specifics, so we don't know exactly what NC's levy limit would look like. And it's also really important to note that the state actually already has the power to enact a levy limit. So why propose a constitutional amendment that requires the state to do something that it is already allowed to do? That's unclear. It could be to make voters think that the state legislators are going to fix their property tax issues and to point a finger at county and local government spending as the primary reason that property taxes are increasingly burdensome. And advocates for levy limits for this kind of proposal say that it makes local governments prioritize and spend more responsibly. But as we all know, the problem with this argument is that it doesn't consider the context of the state or federal funding cuts and all the shifts that have made it harder for local governments to fund critical services, or that all 100 counties across North Carolina have vastly different situations before them, and that a one-size-fits-all approach takes local control away while not solving the problems that they're using to justify this proposal. And just to kind of home in on that, legislators have used examples of elders on fixed income with skyrocketing property taxes in revaluation years as their primary examples to justify this proposal. And the problem with that is a levy limit won't help those folks in any substantial way.
Yeah. So there's a lot there, but going off of the last piece, so if we go with your example of that 2.5% levy limit or a particular levy limit, if applied, so if this constitutional amendment were to go through, that would require the General Assembly to enact a levy limit that they're already authorized to do, what relief could it actually provide compared to the property tax relief programs that we already have in existence?
Right. So even a restrictive levy limit would not have a major impact on most cost burden tax homeowners because it's restricting overall property tax growth instead of improving targeted relief. So let's take an example used in the House Select Committee meetings that they gave, which was an elder on fixed income. Say they're making $45,000 in Forsyth County, whose property taxes increased from $2,500 to $5,000 in a recent revaluation, which was an example somebody brought forward. Had a restrictive 2.5 levy limit been in place, that homeowner would have still seen her property taxes go from $2,500 to $4,700. So it would have still almost doubled. In other words, it would decrease her burden slightly by a couple $100, but she would have still seen almost an over $2,000 increase in her property taxes. And at the same time, Forsyth County would have had to cut millions from its budget that went to fund education and critical services. So now her grandkid is not getting the support in the school that he needs. Now, this homeowner struggle is real, and we have worked with hundreds of folks like this who have similar issues and similar rises, skyrocketing property taxes. But the real problem is that the state's relief programs don't effectively reach this homeowner, despite being elderly, lower income, and cost burdened. So she doesn't qualify for the state's homestead program, which would cut her property taxes in half, because the income threshold for that program is so low and it doesn't take into account a bunch of other factors. She also could qualify for another state relief program called the Circuit Breaker, which would have capped her property taxes at 5% of her income, which would be major. And that actually would have reduced her property taxes. But it requires a deferral of property taxes. And most homeowners don't want to pass a burden on to the next generation. And in fact, that program is written in such a confusing way, and it's so unpopular that 76 counties in North Carolina don't have a single homeowner using it.
Wow. So just in listening to what you're saying, existing, relief programs, if this homeowner that was brought up was eligible, there are two programs that could have provided significant relief. That could have reduced her bill in half or capped it at 5%. But it sounds like in addition to kind of eligibility thresholds, there are other things that need to be changed. So what changes to the property tax relief programs in North Carolina do you think would have the most impact without hamstringing our local governments?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's one that we've really been exploring with a lot of statewide partners and with homeowners and real examples. So simple fixes could transform these relief programs to make them reach thousands of cost burdened homeowners in substantial ways without hamstringing local governments like levy limits would. And that's one of the balances that we're trying to figure out, is how to not hamstring local governments that are already struggling as well. So changing the income restrictions to an area median income threshold for these state relief programs would really allow the programs to serve more North Carolinians with rising tax burdens and high cost of living counties, many of which are already trying to expand property tax relief without undermining revenue, especially in Tier 1 counties that are, again, struggling to get revenue from property taxes. In the circuit breaker, removing that deferral requirement would be transformative. That deters homeowners across the state from using the program. And we could also make some simple changes to both programs that would allow them to be accessible to heir property owners who are occupying the residence as their primary residence. Right now, both programs limit that ability. And we're also recommending that the state could remove the age requirement for the circuit breaker, which is, again, a cost burden based program. And that would be huge because it would allow folks who, for example, are 62 and live in a Habitat for Humanity home and whose property taxes have become more than 10% of their income to actually receive relief as well, who have stayed in their home for many years. So just to go back to that example of cost burden elders we've used before and that the state legislators have used often, we compared several real examples across different size counties, small, medium, and large, and found that making the fixes that we're suggesting to these relief programs would have entirely offset those dramatic rises for a bunch of different examples: married couples, folks with doubling taxes, folks with 20% cost burden of property taxes. And here's the amazing thing: the loss of revenue to counties would be far less across the board, especially in rural counties that are really struggling. And so it would be a targeted way to really address the skyrocketing property taxes and not hamstring local governments.
It sounds like we have some continuously, we're getting more and more clear on what relief actually looks like, both understanding what it means for, neighborhoods here in the Triangle, but across the state, and trying to strike that balance is really important. That being said, as the short session, begins, we're now in the second week. Where do you think the General Assembly should be focusing their energy to most effectively support cost-burdened North Carolina homeowners?
Yeah, that's a really important question. And I think that both what we see across the country in best practices, but also in what we've heard from homeowners all across North Carolina, is there do need to be improvements to the property tax programs. And there's several kind of things that we see that would make a huge difference. Improving that targeted relief, and we already have those two programs on the books. They're already popular. They could be a lot more popular and a lot more effective. So let's improve those. We also could improve assessments and make them fairer, and have the state actually support counties to do assessments in ways that don't shift the burden to lower income homeowners and residential property owners across the state of North Carolina. And that would actually increase revenues in a lot of counties. And finally, we can increase transparency. It's very confusing how revaluations impact people's property taxes. There's a lot of very simple things that can increase the transparency of what's happening with property taxes in ways that I think are both helpful for counties, but also helpful for individual homeowners to really understand what's expected of them. And so there are simple changes: transparency, relief, and fairness that would all make a big difference. And unfortunately, the levy limit does none of those things. It doesn't improve any of those things. And so what we're really hoping is that we can shift them to make these kind of targeted changes that would really transform our system in a way that would be very helpful for both cost burden folks, but also for all folks to really understand what's happening and to know what to prepare for.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Hudson, for joining us this morning. We really appreciate it. Folks, we're going to link up a few resources and talking points, and we're going to make sure that you all have those examples, but also feel free to send us your stories, your examples, and your thoughts around property tax relief, because we would love to continue to lift up examples and real life situations and show how these targeted improvements and policy changes could actually provide relief as opposed to what's being proposed at the moment. So really quickly, our last kind of high level thing that I'll lift up is on the federal side. We do have an advocacy opportunity in addition to Housing Day this week. There is a deadline, a comment deadline for a work requirements and time limits proposed rule. The deadline is May 1st, which is this Friday. On March 2nd, HUD actually proposed allowing public housing agencies and HUD assisted owners to impose work requirements and time limits on assisted families. And so in a recent analysis by the Center for Budget Policy and Priorities, they found that a 2-year time limit on assistance would result in about 3.3 million people losing their rental assistance, and most of them, around 1.7 million, would be children. So we're going to link the proposed rule here in the call notes for you, and we're going to also we're going to link a few templates that the one of our partners has to submit comments as well. And I also want to lift up the fact on the state side that Governor Stein last week released his proposed budget, and it did include several affordable housing and community development funding proposals. So the North Carolina Housing Trust Fund, the Workforce Housing Loan Program, local government grants, transition to community living, and several others were included in this proposal. This is a big deal. Again, we are the only state in the country without a budget, and that means that our workforce housing loan program is essentially non-existent until we do. And so that is why a lot of what we'll be talking about this week at Housing Day will include the Housing Trust Fund and the Workforce Housing Loan Program. All right, y'all, we have a lot more in our call notes that I hope you all will take a few moments to review and read. Some great events, reports, and resources. As always, we really appreciate you tuning in. If you have any questions or concerns or want us to dive into anything else in particular, please don't hesitate to reach out. Thank you again to Hudson Vaughn for joining us this morning, and we will talk to you all next time.